Robert, what have we got on today's show?
Kate, we've got heirs, spares and utter despair, because when spares go wrong, it's very bad news for the crown. Hello and welcome to another episode of Queens, Kings and Dastardly Things. I'm Robert Hardman, Daily Mail columnist, royal biographer. I'm joined as ever by Professor Kate Williams, also royal historian, royal biographer. Hello, Kate.
Good to see you, Robert.
And we are continuing our look at royal spares. The concept of the spare, as we've discussed before, was brought very much to global prominence by Prince Harry in his 2024 mega bestseller called The Spare, in which he talked about
Spare, wasn't it?
Actually, sorry, it's just called Spare. There's no definite article, but it's definitely an extraordinary read, probably the weirdest, most revealing royal memoir ever. But it does raise the subject, doesn't it, Kate, of what do you do when you're born into the family, your sole real raison d'etre is you're on standby in case the anointed heir to the throne disappears or whatever. But otherwise, you're constantly spending your life in reserve. And in our last episode, we looked at spares who turned out to be great successes, who rose to the top and were a great credit to the crown and themselves. And your candidate was, remind us?
Elizabeth I, the spare that nobody wanted, not just a spare because she was the third child of Henry VIII third legitimate after Edward VI and Mary I, but she was also a female daughter of Anne Boleyn, who'd been vilified and hated, and she was classed as a bastard because the marriage was illegitimate. So every disadvantage. And
I nominated as my successful spare George V, the second son of Edward VII, never born to rule, but after the death of his elder brother Eddie, who was a complete wastrel, he turned out, George, to be an exemplary monarch. Dull, perhaps, but saw the monarchy through the First World War, great upheaval, crowns and crowned heads all over Europe being bumped off and massacred. He died peacefully in his bed and ultimately gave us Elizabeth II, his granddaughter. But anyway, today we are turning our attention to those spares that really we can be very grateful we never had on the throne.
Some of them we did.
Well, sorry,
some
yes.
Of them we did.
Some of them we did. We weren't supposed to. Luckily, they didn't last too long.
Because you might say, oh, well, is it that spares rise to the occasion when they do get to be monarch? But we do have a few examples of those who rose to the occasion and weren't like Elizabeth I or George V. But it's a very brutal phrase, isn't it? Heir and the spare. There's something very cruel about it. And I think Prince Harry actually says in his book, I was born in case something happened to Willie. No other second child thinks that. Most second child of a parent think it's because my parents wanted two children. They wanted to have two children or three children. They don't think it's because of that. And all of Prince Harry's memoir, so much of it was crafted by the theme of the spare. But as we were saying, when you are a monarch, it's not a choice to have one child. You do have to have two or three. You are expected to have a sort of collection. And then what does it mean for the one who doesn't get to come to the throne? Is it, as in the ABBA song, winner takes all? One gets the throne, one gets the palaces, one gets all the attention, and the other, what do they get?
Pick a collection of spares.
The biggest royal family pretty much in British history of surviving children. We are looking at George III, 15 children, 13 survive, and these are 7 sons, 6 daughters, and as children, everyone thought, what a bonny, marvellous family, what a huge amount of lovely children to secure the throne. And then, as they got older, they became, in the words of the Duke of Wellington, the boys especially, he called them damned millstones around the neck of the country. Those 7 sons became rather less of a beautiful family portrait and more of a moral nightmare that actually threatened the survival of the monarchy.
They were all, without exception, problem children. I mean, we're talking about spares. So obviously the heir to the throne, the Prince of Wales, Pryni, goes on to be George IV after a spell as Prince Regent. I mean, I suppose we can be very grateful for his monumental extravagance today, because he's given the royal family and the royal collection some amazing treasures. But he blew the budget.
The frontispiece of Buckingham Palace, with the John Nash
frontispiece. But he behaved absolutely appallingly. He blew the budget. He was completely off his head. I mean, claimed to have been at the Battle of Waterloo when he was actually in bed with his mistress. I mean, the man was a complete monster.
One of my favourite things that he said he had to have a mistress with a larger bosom because it was the best way to display his jewels. So that was his excuse why he had to have a hourglass shape.
But he's the heir. So, I mean, normally we would say, well, if you've got a terrible heir, you might hope that the spares are going to be potentially a quality replacement. But let's look at them. Let's look at these spares. Because, set aside
5 brothers,
George,
6 girls with spares.
So starting with Frederick, Duke of York, what's he like?
My favourite statistic for this rabble of a lot is that by 1800, between them, they had 56 illegitimate children and 1 legitimate heir. That was the daughter of George, the eldest, Princess Charlotte. He conceived a child with his wife, Princess Caroline, hated her and then got rid of her, and then spent the rest of his life trying to divorce her. So when a messenger came to him to tell him about the death of Napoleon and said, "Sire, your greatest enemy is dead," he said, "Oh, is she really?" Because he thought it was his wife, because he hated her that much. So 1 legitimate child, the rest had created illegitimate children, mistresses. George II brought in the Royal Marriages Act to try and control...
To try and stop precisely this sort of degeneracy.
Marrying strange people. You had to agree, you had to get the assent of the monarch if you wished to marry under your age of majority. So what we have...
By the way, it's a law that still applies today. I mean, right. It got reformed a bit in as recently as 2013, but still the top 6 in line still have to ask the monarch. Got to check that they're happy.
Okay, if I marry this person. And I feel very sorry for the daughters of George III. They were pretty much locked up in Windsor Castle because he didn't want them to get married. He wanted them always by his side. Queen Charlotte was devastated and traumatised by his mental illness and used them as comforts, and they really couldn't escape. And some of them did have affairs with their grooms, but we'll go into that later. But the sons, they were wild and selfish, and I think they treated their mistresses very poorly. So, for example, we have the Duke of York, number 2.
Let's start, So we've had George as the heir. He's a disaster, but he becomes king because he has to be king.
A disaster with nice paintings.
Next one down is Fred, Duke of York.
Duke of York, and he doesn't have children with his wife. He has a mistress, Mary Ann Clark, and he's head of the armed forces, and she doesn't have enough money to keep up the life that she needs to have to be his mistress, because he wants dinners, he wants glamour, he wants beauty. So what she starts doing is selling army commissions, and when this is found out, it becomes a huge scandal, and of course the royal family expect her to say, "I'm so sorry, I'm guilty," and just go away and say nothing. But she's too clever for that, and I really admire her. She gets up in front of the inquiry and she reads out the Duke of York's love letters. She makes it very clear that she's not just someone who can be dismissed. She reads out his love letters. It's a total disgrace. So he falls into disgrace. He doesn't have any children with his wife, doesn't come to the throne. Next one down.
Next one, we get on to the one who does come to
Duke
the throne.
Duke of the Clarence, who comes to the throne as William IV.
He is the spare, and he actually gets to the throne, but I mean, he's nothing to write home about either. By then, George IV has had his very expensive but fairly short reign. He's died. It goes to brother, the Sailor King William, who, as Duke of Clarence, was sent off to sea in the Royal Navy, saw action. I mean, you can't fault the fact that he did actually do proper time in the Navy and wasn't bad at it. And actually, I think spent the rest of his life wishing he was still in the Navy. But briefly holds the distinction of standing up in the House of Lords and making a speech, which, of course, today no member of the royal family would enter the political fray. He actually did stand up and defend slavery. So that wasn't great. Married to Queen Adelaide.
He also was very unpopular because he was against the Reform Act, which was expanding voting. Among the things he also threatened to do was kick the head of the Royal Academy downstairs because he was being annoying. My most emblematic story about William IV is that apparently when he was told he was king, he said he was going straight back to bed because he'd never been to bed with a queen before. So that's what he thought he'd do. But I feel very sorry for his mistress in particular, who was Dorothea Jordan.
Well, this is it. He had no legitimate children, but he had an actress, famous actress.
He had a famous actress. She was his mistress, his partner. I think the word mistress is very outdated, isn't it? She was his partner. They had 10 children together. She was, I think, the greatest Shakespearean comic actress of her day. She was so talented. They loved her. She had all these children by him. She pretty much funded their lifestyle. And then what happens is that changes her life pretty much is that when Princess Charlotte, who he mentioned as the daughter of George IV, when she dies and the baby dies as well in this heartbreaking story, disastrous labour where she dies at the end of it, heartbreaking, all the brothers then go for the race to dump their mistresses and find wives. And there was a rhyme about it at the time, which was hot and hard each royal pair are at it going for the heir, because they suddenly think they can get their debts paid off, they can get glory if they have this child. So once William realises that he might have a chance of having the heir, he gets rid of Mrs. Jordan and he really sets her aside and then goes and marries Queen Adelaide. Adelaide is a wonderful woman, and William, I think, one redeeming feature is he holds on to life as hard as he can. So Queen Victoria comes to the throne as an adult, not as a minor, therefore controlled by her mother and John Conroy. So that is redeeming feature.
Yes, Kate, as you say, it's William IV who keeps the throne warm for Victoria. But where's Victoria come from? Well, in this race to try and produce a legitimate heir, it's son number 4 of George III, who is the Duke of Kent, Edward, Duke of Kent. He's a pretty disreputable military man. It's quite hard to find postings for him in the army because he's so unpopular. He nearly causes a mutiny in Gibraltar, I think. At one point he gets sent off to Canada. But suddenly, as you say, the race is on. Oh my gosh, whoever can produce an heir, could actually end up producing the next generation of monarchs. So he dumps his mistress, his much loved
long term, and apparently the way he does it, isn't it, is that he passes her a copy of the newspaper, by which the newspaper is saying it is incumbent on the sons of George III to now find wives. This is much worse than not answering a text, isn't it? It's pretty cool.
But this is dynastic war games circa 1800, and so he goes off and he marries. There is suddenly a Duchess of Kent. And sure enough, they produce this little girl, Victoria, and he dies soon afterwards. He's barely there in her childhood. But the fact is that there is a spare who, I suppose, performed one particularly important historic duty, which is that he gave us Queen Victoria. But then he didn't hang around long after that. And then who comes along next? So I think possibly, arguably, of all the spares that George III and Queen Charlotte produced, the next one down, I think, is probably the least likeable of all, isn't he?
I mean, it's a competition. It's a competition. But we now have Ernest, who becomes Duke of Hanover. He becomes Duke of Hanover when Queen Victoria ascends to the throne, because Hanover has always been part of the British throne, but it cannot be taken by a woman. So he takes that throne. He's the younger down. He is, I think,
before that, though, he's the Duke of Cumberland.
The Duke of Cumberland
in this country. He gets given the title Duke of Cumberland, and the previous Duke of Cumberland, of course, was Butcher Cumberland, different branch of the family.
It's not a good title. It's not a good title.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's really wanted to be Duke of Cumberland ever since. I think everyone's quite happy to leave it to the sausage to bear the Cumberland
we love
name.
Cumberland, and this is a disastrous. He is the least popular of all of them. He is hated. He's selfish. He's very disliked.
But why?
And then the big scandal is that in 1810 he wakes up shouting in St James's Palace, I'm murdered, and they find he's been hit on the head. And then when people rush through the palace, they find his servant behind a locked door with his throat cut to the back. And the inquest says that servant tried to kill the Duke, failed, ran off, slit his own throat to that extreme level, which we might doubt. but no one believes it. Everyone thinks that the Duke was involved. There was some kind of blackmail plot. There was possibly a love triangle between him and both male servants. He is so hated. And this is one of the reasons why Queen Victoria famously hates the fact that as a young princess, Princess Victoria, in Kensington Palace, her food's always tasted and she has to have her hand held when she's walking downstairs until she's 12 or so, because they're terrified that he is going to bump her off. He's going to kill her so he can get to the throne. Now, you might say, oh my goodness, that belongs in ancient Rome. But people did really fear that he was going to bump her off. And when Victoria has her child, Princess Vicky, she's rather disappointed because she's hoping for a boy. And all the ministers say to her, we don't mind one child between the throne and him. We don't mind what sex it is, because we don't want this man coming anywhere near the throne.
Well, that's a spare we were very lucky to dodge. The George III and Charlotte production line had more treats for us. Next one down was Augustus, Duke of Sussex, I think. The Duke of Sussex is not a title that's had a great deal of luck, is it?
I would say, Robert, once we get to the younger ones, they're not quite as bad as the older ones. They are spendthrift, they have mistresses, but because they're much farther from the throne and power, they're not quite so entitled. So the Duke of Sussex I'm particularly unfond of, because when Emma Hamilton, who I wrote my first book on, she's in debtor's prison, really on her knees in terms of money. She sold off Sir William Hamilton's copy of the Doomsday Book. He comes to dine with her, and they have a marvellous time dining. Of course, she thinks he's royal, he might help him. And when you're in debtor's prison, things cost a lot. So dinners cost a lot. So he dines with her along with his mistress,
Mrs. Dinner in a prison.
In debtor's prison with Emma Hamilton, with his mistress, Mrs. Celia Bugg, who he later marries. And I think it's one way in which he can be entertained with his mistress. So I don't like him for that respect, but I think compared to the others, he's not quite as bad. But there's this litter of illegitimate children coming from these sons, and there are actually some coming from the daughters. So the daughters do have this pretty sad time. George III won't allow them to marry. He has to sign off on their marriages, as we said, and he won't allow them to marry. He's heartbroken by the death of the youngest, Amelia. He won't let them out of his sight. Queen Charlotte also won't let them out of her sight because she's using them really as unpaid companions. And finally, they do get to marry later, but it's too late for them to have children. But there are a couple of illegitimate children, we believe, among those sisters, with grooms, with men in the household.
Well, Kate, there's still one left, actually. That is Adolphus, who becomes Duke of Cambridge, who I suppose is probably the sort of least reprehensible. I mean, he's a moderately distinguished soldier. He's sent off, like so many of them are, to Hanover to learn how to be a soldier. But he does rack up some pretty extraordinary debts. But it is funny that those last two sons of George III, they both have titles that will be recreated many, many years later. So you've got a Duke of Sussex and a Duke of Cambridge. And I think we can agree that the Duke of Sussex and the Duke of Cambridge that we've had in our lifetime, singularly more successful and preferable to the 18th, 19th century variety. But I mean, it's hard to think of a family with so much promise. And let's not forget, I mean, at that point, George III is the longest reigning monarch in history. Yes, he's lost America. Yes, eventually he loses his mind, although now I think we'd call it dementia. But nonetheless, on his watch, Britain achieves great things. Suddenly, the Union flag is planted in places like kind of Australia. There's great scientific progress.
And he's the first, one who can really speak English and take notes.
He's the first Georgian who's born in Britain and speaks English. Yeah, and he's very cultured.
Obviously they could speak English, before, but does not. He is a man who really believes in the country.
Yeah, and he's a great expert on farming, on science, on astronomy. He had his problems, but on his watch, he saw off the greatest threat to the world, which was Napoleon, and he died peacefully in his own bed. So I think in that regard, he really could have expected to have had at least one son who could have vaguely done him justice, and he didn't.
you think about a second in line who had an unhappy life, you can't help but think about Princess Margaret. As soon as her sister became the heir in 1936, it was very clear that that was not going to be Margaret's life. Up until then, they had really been expected to lead a similar sort of life, married into the aristocracy, a sort of life in the countryside. And then in 1936, everything changes. Elizabeth becomes clearly the future queen, and Margaret is this female spare.
Yeah, I think it was very tough for her because she was subjected to a sort of series of slights. So on the one hand, she's expected to dress just like her older sister. I mean, they look alike, they wear the same clothes, they do the same things. But right from an early age, Elizabeth gets proper education. She gets proper history lessons from Sir Henry Martin at Eton. Margaret doesn't. Elizabeth gets to wear uniform and serve in the war, and Margaret doesn't. Elizabeth gets to have her own household and do engagements, and Margaret doesn't. And these are things that she resents really all through life. And they do, I think, account for that slightly rebellious streak in her that was there all the way until her death in 2002. But that's why I think at the moment, it is said that the Prince and Princess of Wales are very, very conscious, very concerned to make sure that, of course, Prince George is the heir, and that's the way it's going to be. It's a hereditary, hierarchical, constitutional monarchy. You can't change that. There are ways, I think, in which you can try and ensure that don't leave the younger ones feeling that they're any less loved or any less relevant. They're just going to have to accept that their career path is going to be different.
Of course, what is the career path? That's something that we'll be thinking about when George and...
That sounds like one for another episode, Kate.
What is it, when Charlotte and Louis grow older, because I think increasingly we're saying that the second, the third should be able to have their own careers. But as we've seen with royals, it's very difficult to have your own career. When you're a spare, you get more criticised. So, for example, when Margaret gets caught, we might see this as a watershed moment when Margaret gets caught with Roddy Llewellyn, and it's all over the front pages of the newspapers, and she's called a royal parasite in the House of Commons. She's hated, she's reviled for having this affair with Roddy Llewellyn. That's a pretty brutal treatment of Margaret that we perhaps wouldn't see if that had been the monarch or the first in line.
Well, that very wise old courtier, Lord Charteris, Martin Charteris, who was one of Elizabeth II's favourite private secretaries, he always said later in life that it's very important in every royal family, in every generation, you have to have a wicked fairy to take the flag, effectively act as a sort of lightning.
Wicked fairy to take the flag.
And I think Princess Margaret probably did more than her fair share of life as the wicked fairy.
Because you need to have someone who can be criticised and called a royal parasite.
I mean, you've got to have one who is you've got to have your yin and your yang, or whatever you want to put it.
And that's what Harry would say very much, that he'd been the way he'd been treated, that stories about him in his teenage years were put in the newspapers, but stories about other members of the royal family were covered up. I think he talked in the documentary about horse trading, didn't he, about horse trading stories, and he very much felt that he was the one whose mistakes, errors had been exposed to the nation, but other people's had been covered up, that he'd been cast as the wicked wizard or the wicked fairy.
Well, I think he felt it, and I think he still feels it to this day. I mean, I would have to say, in defence of William, I think overall, I think you say Harry probably just was intrinsically more naughty than Prince William. I don't think Prince William was ever sort of on a kind of boys' night in Las Vegas or whatever.
It was the Nazi uniform, wasn't it? That was the big
yes,
star.
I think if you are the youngest or the younger, you are going to be you're given a certain amount of extra leeway.
It's interesting, isn't it, that on one hand we want the younger one to be more fun, more partying, more going out nightclubbing. But if they go too far, then they get attacked and criticised. Being a teenager is hard enough, let alone if your teenage errors are all over the press.
Well, he more than made up for it in Spare, because if you want stories of royal drug taking, well, Harry gives us those literally by the bag load. So I think on that note, we can all reflect that it's tough being a number two. But boy, are we lucky we didn't have George III's team of numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7. Well, that's all we have time for this week, but thank you very much for joining us on Queens, Kings and Dastardly Things. From me, Robert Hardman, goodbye.
And from me, Kate Williams, goodbye, and thank you for listening.